Man walking through forest hears a baby crying, and upon approaching finds an abandoned baby next to a giant snake. What he does next will surprise you. Married for nearly a decade, Brian and Isabella lived a solid and harmonious relationship built on respect and companionship. Over the years, they shared countless moments of joy, but also faced a persistent challenge together: the difficulty of having children. Despite trying various medical treatments and going through constant consultations, the longed-for pregnancy never happened. This struggle, although frustrating, never managed to shake their bond. They shared the dream of starting a family, but knew that the most important thing was to maintain the love they felt for each other above any obstacle. It was a peaceful Sunday, and the clock marked the early afternoon. Brian and Isabella were in the living room after lunch, sitting on the couch. He ran his hand across his forehead, a gesture he always made when tired, while Isabella absent-mindedly fiddled with the fabric of her dress. "Isabella," Brian said, breaking the silence, "I was thinking of heading to the river today, you know. Do a little fishing. I need to clear my mind from work." He looked at her with a tired yet serene expression. Isabella lifted her gaze, studying him for a moment. "I think that's a good idea," she replied, adjusting herself on the couch. "You've been working so much lately. Fishing always helps you relax, doesn't it?" "Yeah, it always helps," Brian agreed. "But if I don't go now, it might get too late." He lightly chuckled, trying to ease the seriousness of his expression. Isabella smiled and shrugged. "Then go ahead, but don't come back too late, okay? I don't want to worry." Brian nodded with a smile. "I promise. I'll be back before nightfall." He stood up, walked to the shed in the backyard, and began to gather his things. In the small storage space, he grabbed the fishing rod, the tackle box with hooks and bait, and a bag with some snacks and water. He double-checked everything, just like he always did before going fishing, and then walked back into the living room with his belongings. "Everything's ready," he said, placing the bag over his shoulder. "I won't take long, I swear." "All right," Isabella replied, standing up to give him a hug. "Take care, Brian." "Don't worry." He smiled and kissed her forehead before heading out the door. Brian got in the car, placed his things in the back seat, and left. The drive to the forest was familiar and peaceful. He enjoyed the route, where tall trees soon began to appear along the sides of the road, like an invitation to tranquility. When he arrived at the location, he parked the car near the entrance to a trail. He grabbed his things and started walking along the narrow trail, smelling the damp earth and feeling the coolness of the vegetation. The sound of the river flowing in the distance was comforting, as if already announcing the rest he sought. The trail was marked by footsteps from many fishermen who also visited the spot, but that day it seemed Brian was the only one there. When he reached the riverbank, he chose a flat spot and began setting up his equipment. He sat on a fallen log, carefully pulling out the fishing rod and checking the line while humming a random tune to himself. However, before he could cast the line into the water, an unexpected sound cut through the air. It was a loud, desperate cry, undoubtedly from a baby. Brian froze immediately, his heart racing. "What is that?" he muttered to himself, standing up and looking around. The crying seemed to come from somewhere in the forest, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. Leaving his belongings on the ground, he followed the sound, stepping into a denser area of bushes. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he shouted, his voice echoing among the trees. But no one answered, and the sound of the crying continued, getting closer. Brian quickened his pace, struggling to navigate through the thick vegetation. He pushed branches aside with his hands, tripped over roots, and got scratched by plants, but kept moving. The sound was persistent, guiding him like an invisible trail. When he finally pushed a tangle of branches aside, he stopped suddenly. There it was, a small baby wrapped in an old blanket, crying loudly in the middle of the forest. "My God!" Brian exclaimed, still in disbelief. "What is a baby doing here?" He stood still for a moment, trying to process the scene. The crying seemed even louder now that he was close, like a scream of desperation that pierced the soul. Brian immediately decided that he had to help. He took a step forward, but something on the ground caught his attention. A few meters from the baby, a huge snake was slithering slowly but precisely toward the child. Brian's blood ran cold. He held his breath, unsure whether to move quickly or cautiously. But seeing the imminent danger, he had no doubts. He had to act. "No, no, no," he muttered as his steps became faster. He stumbled on branches and almost fell, but didn't slow down. The snake seemed closer and closer to the baby. Brian felt his heart pounding in his chest, and panic turned into adrenaline, pushing him forward. When he finally reached the baby, the snake was just about to strike. In an instinctive and desperate movement, Brian lunged toward the baby and lifted it into his arms just as the snake attacked, sinking its venomous fangs into his leg. Brian screamed in pain as he felt the snake's fangs sink into his leg. The pain was sharp and intense, radiating through his body like a wave of fire. He instinctively kicked the snake, which slowly retreated as he fell to his knees, protecting the baby in his arms. His heart raced, and he looked at the wound, where 2 small holes bled, feeling a slight tingling in his leg. His breath was shallow, but he knew he couldn't panic. "Damn snake," he said between clenched teeth as he tried to get up. "I hope you're not venomous." He looked at the baby, still crying loudly, and whispered, "Calm down, little one, calm down. Everything will be okay." Carefully, he placed the baby on a patch of grass beside him, trying to keep it safe. "Don't cry. I'm here," he whispered while gently stroking the child's small head. Then he began to take off his shirt, his movements hurried and clumsy with desperation. He tore it into strips, speaking to himself to stay focused. "I need to do this fast. If it's venomous, this could help." He tied the strip tightly above the bite, using all the strength he had left. "I hope this works," he said aloud, tightening the knot as much as he could. The throbbing pain in his leg grew worse, and sweat trickled down his forehead. The baby began to calm down, perhaps sensing the soft tone of Brian's voice. He picked the baby up again, taking a deep breath to decide what to do next. "I have to get out of here. I can't stay," he murmured, looking at the trail he had come from. "Come on, little one, just a little more." Hobbling and with pain increasing with every step, Brian started his way back to the car. Each movement felt like a monumental effort. The weight of the baby in his arms wasn't heavy, but his leg seemed to be growing weaker, almost useless. He paused for a moment, leaning against a tree and trying to breathe. "Damn it, I think it was venomous," he muttered to himself, realizing that his leg was starting to feel numb. "But I can't stop." With increasingly uncoordinated steps, Brian finally saw the car. "We're almost there," he said, as if encouraging both the baby and himself. He reached the vehicle, opened the back door with difficulty, and carefully placed the child on the seat, wrapped in the old blanket. He made sure it was positioned safely so it wouldn't fall during the trip. "Now, we just need to get home." Brian slumped into the driver's seat and started the car, but soon realized how difficult it would be to drive. His leg wasn't responding as it should, and pressing the pedals seemed impossible. He breathed deeply, trying to summon strength. "Come on, just a little more," he said, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands. His eyes seemed to want to close, but he fought against the weakness. The car bounced along the road as Brian tried to keep control. His vision began to blur, and he knew time was running out. "Stay awake, Brian. You can do it," he murmured, as if saying a mantra to keep himself from passing out. Finally, he reached home. He parked the car awkwardly at the entrance and got out with difficulty, grabbing the baby again. His legs wobbled, and he almost collapsed as he crossed the living room door. Isabella was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when she heard the front door opening. She lifted her eyes with curiosity, expecting to see Brian walk in as usual, but her expression immediately changed when she saw him staggering through the door, pale and sweating. He was carrying something in his arms, a baby. "Brian, what happened?" she shouted, dropping the book on the floor and running toward him. He leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. "Isabella," he murmured with a trembling voice, his steps hesitant as he advanced into the living room. "I found this baby in the forest." Isabella stared at him, shocked, but she realized something was wrong. "You're all sweaty and why are you limping? What's that on your leg?" Brian nearly collapsed onto the couch, carefully handing the baby to his wife. "I was bitten by a snake. I was fishing in the forest, and I heard the cry of a baby." He paused, gasping for breath. "I followed the sound. I found this little one, alone, abandoned, and the snake was going toward him." Isabella gasped, holding the baby tightly and looking at Brian with wide eyes. "A snake? My God, Brian! You were bitten and still you managed to save the baby. How did that happen?" He tried to explain, but his voice was growing weaker. "I ran, grabbed the baby before the snake, but it bit my leg. I tore my shirt and made a tourniquet, but I think it was venomous. My leg is going numb." Isabella started to panic, looking at the wound on his leg and seeing the swelling spreading. "This is serious. Brian, you need help now." She was already reaching for the phone, but he raised his hand as if he wanted to say more. "Isabella, call emergency. Quick," he murmured before his eyes began to close. "Brian, stay with me," she cried, shaking him lightly while holding the baby with one hand. Without waiting any longer, she dialed emergency. "Hello, emergency. Please send an ambulance quickly. My husband was bitten by a snake. He's really bad." "Ma'am, please stay calm," the operator on the other end replied. "I need more information. What's your location?" "We're at home, 48 Spring Street," she said, her voice trembling. "He was bitten by a snake in the forest while fishing. And my God, he found a baby there, an abandoned baby. He brought it home, but he's almost passing out. Please, come quickly. He's getting worse." "Understood, ma'am. An ambulance is on its way. Keep your husband still. As for the baby, is it okay?" Yes, it seems fine, but I don't know. He was alone in the forest. I don't know what could have happened before." Isabella looked at the baby, who was now silent, staring at her with large, curious eyes. "Okay, ma'am. The medical team will take care of both once they arrive. Stay on the line in case something changes," the operator instructed. Isabella hung up, trying to remain calm. She looked at the baby, who seemed so fragile in her arms. "You're so small," she whispered, adjusting the blanket around him. "Why would anyone do this to you? Don't worry, we'll take care of you." She ran to grab a clean towel and a wet cloth, gently wiping the child's face, which was a little dirty from the dirt. "It's going to be okay, my little angel," she whispered, trying to focus on the baby while waiting for the ambulance to arrive. The sound of the siren finally cut through the silence of the street, and Isabella ran to open the door. 2 paramedics rushed in quickly, their equipment backpacks in hand. "He's over there," Isabella said, pointing to Brian, who was unconscious on the couch. One of the paramedics approached Brian, checking his vital signs and examining the bite on his leg. "Snake bite," he said to his colleague. "The tourniquet helped slow the venom, but we need to act fast." "He said the snake bit him while saving the baby," Isabella explained, still trembling. "This baby was found alone in the forest. I don't know what happened before, but he brought the child here." The second paramedic approached Isabella and extended his arms. "We can take care of the baby too, ma'am. He may need some exams." "Yes, of course," she said, reluctantly handing over the baby, but knowing it was the best thing to do. The paramedics stabilized Brian on the stretcher while Isabella held his hand. "You're going to be fine, my love," she said, trying to hold back the tears. In the ambulance, one of the paramedics kept Brian's vital signs under control, while the other examined the baby. "He seems to be physically fine, but it's good to check if he suffered any trauma," he commented. Isabella, sitting beside him, was anxious. "Do you think he'll be okay? And the baby? He's so small, I can't even imagine what he's been through." "We're doing everything we can, Ma'am," the paramedic replied. "Your husband is strong, and the baby is in good condition." When they arrived at the hospital, a medical team was already waiting. Brian was quickly taken to a room, while another group took the baby for examination. Isabella stood still for a moment, not knowing where to go, until a nurse approached. "Ma'am, we'll take care of your husband. He'll need tests and maybe an antidote, depending on the type of snake. The baby will also be evaluated. You can wait in the next room." Isabella nodded, though she was still in shock. She walked to a bench and sat down, running her hands over her face. The silence in the room seemed unbearable, but she knew she needed to be strong. "Please," she whispered to herself, "let them both be okay." The hours dragged on as Isabella sat on the bench in the hospital, restless and consumed by worry. She alternated between looking at the hallway, hoping someone would bring news, and lowering her head, murmuring silent prayers. The silence around her seemed to amplify her anxiety, and the clock on the wall marked time in endless steps. When finally a nurse approached, Isabella almost jumped out of her chair. "Mrs. Isabella?" the nurse called gently. "Yes, any news? How's Brian and the baby?" The flood of questions came before she could stop herself. "Calm down," the nurse said with a smile. "Your husband is awake. He's stable and asked to see you." Isabella took a deep breath, feeling immediate relief, but there was still another worry. "And the baby? Is he okay?" "We're still doing some tests, but he seems healthy. We believe he didn't stay in the forest long, which really helped." Isabella nodded, feeling a little more at ease. Thank God. Without wasting any more time, she followed the nurse to Brian's room. When she opened the door, Isabella found Brian lying in bed, his face pale but already regaining some color. He smiled when he saw her come in. "My love," Isabella said, rushing to hold his hand. "You scared me so much." "Sorry," Brian replied, his voice still weak. "I didn't want to worry you like this. But I'm okay. The doctors said the antidote worked." Isabella felt her eyes welling up with tears. "Did they say anything else?" Brian nodded. "They said the snake was venomous. If I had taken longer to get here, things could have gotten complicated. But now it's under control. I'll need to stay for a few days for observation." Isabella caressed his hand, trying to control her emotions. "You're so brave, Brian. You saved a life today, that child. I can't imagine what would have happened if you hadn't been there." They continued talking for a few minutes until someone knocked on the door. A man entered wearing a police uniform with a notebook in hand. "Sorry to interrupt," the police officer said, taking off his hat in respect. "I'm Officer Gutierrez. We've received a report about the baby found in the forest, and I came to gather some information." Brian, still tired, nodded. "Of course, officer. I'll do my best to help." Gutierrez pulled up a chair and sat next to them. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Brian began recounting the events as accurately as he could. He told about the cry that attracted him, the struggle to get through the bushes and find the baby, and the moment he saw the snake approaching. He described how he acted quickly to save the child, even though he was bitten in the process, and how he managed to get back to the car and drive home. The officer took detailed notes, asking specific questions. Was there any sign of another person nearby? Footprints? Any object that could indicate who left the baby there? "No, nothing," Brian replied. "The place was very isolated. I didn't see anyone, just the baby in the blanket and the snake." Gutierrez thanked them and stood up to leave, but Isabella called him before he could go. "And the baby? What will happen to him?" The police officer paused, looking at the couple with a serious expression. We're still investigating how he ended up there, but so far we have no leads. After the hospital exams, he will likely be taken to an orphanage until the case is resolved or someone claims custody. Isabella lowered her head, visibly shaken. I understand, she said quietly. Thank you, officer. When the officer left, silence filled the room. Brian looked at Isabella, noticing the sadness on her face. Are you okay? Yes. I'm just thinking about the baby. He's so small, Brian. How could anyone abandon him like that? Brian had no answer. He simply squeezed his wife's hand, feeling that this episode would mark both of them in a way they hadn't yet fully understood. The following days were dedicated to Brian's recovery, and he was discharged from the hospital after a week. The couple's life began to return to normal, but the presence of the baby was constantly on their minds. Though they didn't speak about it immediately, both felt a growing unease. One day, while talking after dinner, Brian decided to bring up the subject that had been on his mind. He pushed his empty plate forward, resting his elbows on the table, and looked at Isabella seriously. Isabella, he began, breaking the brief silence in the kitchen. I can't stop thinking about the baby. Do you feel the same way? She sighed, lowering her eyes to the glass she held in her hands. After a moment, she looked back at him. Brian, of course. Since that day, there's not a moment I don't think about him. I keep wondering how he is, if he's being cared for, if he's safe. Me too, Brian said, running his hand through his hair. It's strange, isn't it? We spent so little time with him, but it feels like there's something more, a connection. Exactly, Isabella agreed, leaning a little forward. I know he's in an orphanage now, but not knowing what's happening with him makes me restless. Do you think we could try to learn more about the case? Brian nodded slowly. Yeah, I was thinking about that. Maybe we can go to the police station, talk to that officer who came to see us at the hospital. Gutierrez, wasn't that his name? Yes, Gutierrez, Isabella said, already visibly excited about the idea. We can ask about the baby, see how he's doing, at least find out if he's okay. I agree. Tomorrow after work we can stop by there, Brian suggested. Deal, Isabella said, smiling, though a little melancholic. I just hope the news is good. The next day, at the end of the afternoon, the couple went to the police station. Isabella held the purse with both hands, while Brian walked beside her, still limping slightly, a remnant of the snake bite. At the reception, a uniformed officer greeted them with a polite smile. Good afternoon. How can I help you? He asked. Good afternoon, Brian replied. We are Brian and Isabella. We'd like to speak with Officer Gutierrez if possible. It's about the baby found in the forest. Oh, of course. One moment, I'll call him, the officer said, standing up to fetch his colleague. As they waited, Isabella looked around nervously. What if he says the baby is in bad shape or that something happened, she murmured. Let's stay calm, Isabella. We're just here for answers, Brian replied, trying to convey confidence, though he too was anxious. Soon, Officer Gutierrez appeared. He greeted them with a firm handshake and a warm smile. Mr. and Mrs., how good to see you. Please, come with me to the next room. They followed him to a small, simple room with a table and wooden chairs. They sat down while Gutierrez pulled out a file of documents. So, he began, what brings you here today? Isabella spoke first, her voice trembling but determined. Officer, We've been worried about the baby. We can't stop thinking about him. We want to know how he is and if there are any updates on the case. Gutierrez nodded, flipping through the papers. I understand. You have a kind heart to be so concerned. He paused, as if thinking about the best way to explain. Unfortunately, we don't have much new information. We've searched the area where the baby was found, but haven't found anything indicating who abandoned him. And so far, no one has come forward to claim custody. And what about him? Is he okay? Brian asked, with an anxious tone. Yes, Gutierrez replied with a slight smile. The baby is in good condition. He underwent exams at the hospital and was transferred to an orphanage. The conditions there are good, but you know how it is. It's tough, especially for such a small child. Isabella lowered her head, the officer's words weighing heavily on her heart. So he's going to stay there indefinitely? Probably, Gutierrez answered. Unless a relative shows up or he gets adopted. Brian and Isabella exchanged a look but said nothing. They thanked the officer, who praised their concern, and said goodbye. The weeks that followed were marked by a heavy silence in the house. Although they tried to follow their routines, the presence of that baby continued to linger in their thoughts. Finally, one night, while they were in the living room, Isabella could no longer contain what she was feeling. Brian, she said, turning to him on the couch, I can't take it anymore. I can't stop thinking about the baby. What's happening to me? Brian looked her in the eyes, seeing the tears starting to form. Isabella, you're not alone. I feel the same way. From the moment I held him in my arms, something changed. It's like he was placed in our path. Exactly, she exclaimed, holding his hand. Don't you think this is destiny? Brian, we've always wanted a family. We always tried, and now this child shows up. It can't be a coincidence. Brian took a deep breath, feeling the emotion overflow. I think about that too. But what are you saying? Isabella looked at him with determination. I'm saying that I want to adopt him. I want to give him the home he deserves. Brian smiled slowly but genuinely. You know what? I was waiting for you to say that, because it's exactly what I want too. They embraced, moved, feeling that they were finally making the right decision. In the following days, they began the adoption process. Visits to the orphanage, interviews with social workers, and lots of paperwork filled their days. The couple had to prove they were prepared to offer a stable and loving home. Though the process was long and challenging, they remained steadfast. Brian, I'm nervous, Isabella said during one of their visits to the orphanage. What if they say we're not fit? They'll see how much we love this boy, Brian replied, holding her hand. And we won't give up, Isabella, no matter what happens. Months later, the big day finally arrived. The couple was at the courthouse, signing the papers that would officially make the baby part of their family. When the judge declared the adoption official, Isabella couldn't hold back her tears. Now you are our son, she said, holding the baby in her arms. Brian put his arm around his wife and smiled at the little boy. Finally, we're a family, he said, moved. As they left the courthouse, the sun shone brightly, as if reflecting the new hope that illuminated their lives. The destiny that once seemed so cruel now united them in a way they could never have imagined. The little child brought them the missing piece, and with him a new chapter began, filled with love, resilience, and gratitude. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.